Well, welcome back. Earlier we shared the whakatauki that speaks about collective leadership. Collective leadership is critical to the kaupapa of today's Connect, leading for equity, what's our next step? Many of you will have read the poem written by Ngāi Lefele, Aurere's college head girl, as she reflected on the experiences of her community during lockdown. The words really resonated with me as I've been thinking a lot about equity, access, and potential. She writes at the end of the poem something I just want to share with you all today. If education is key, why do our locks keep changing? If knowledge is power, why does it come at a price we can't afford? Every problem of society taught in class can be found in the hood. Don't need a degree for empathy. It's ironic how New Zealand wants to rebuild, but it's on our backs. What we know for sure is that the tired old ways of struggling to create equitable spaces just hasn't worked. And what we know is that we need different tools for reimagining a more equitable future. Our speakers today are futurist leaders who are reimagining a different Aotearoa that challenge traditional ideas of going back to the future. Tarena from Tokona Raki Māori Futures Collective and Cheryl Doig from Think Beyond have contributed a great deal in this area. I think you're all familiar with Zoom before I introduce the speakers, but if not, on the top right hand screen there's gallery view or speaker view. If you click on speaker view, then it will be easier for you to follow them as they're also going to be sharing slides. Additionally, we'd also really encourage you to take down some notes or fire some notes into chat, as there'll be a Q&A time later and also after the speakers time for group discussion. So first up, we're going to hear from Cheryl Doig. Cheryl is a leadership futurist with an extensive background in education and governance. Cheryl is a senior consultant at the Leadership Lab, a leader at Grow Waitaha, and a trustee of Ako Otutahi Learning City, Christchurch. She has been on the boards of 3 startup schools and is currently board chair of the New Zealand Brain Research Institute. We'll also hear from Eruera Tarena is Kaihotu, Executive Director of Tokona Raki, a Ngāi Tahu Social Innovation Lab, focused on achieving equity for all Māori and Ngāi Tahu in the Ngāi Tahu Takiwa by 2040. His team works across key areas, 3 key areas: future-focused insights and research, building the capability for Ngāi Tahu to lead innovation, and supporting partners to transform their practices. His team recently released, and I think some of you have read this, some future scenarios that explore what an equitable, te tiriti-based and bicultural Aotearoa looks like. Ngā mihi nui ki a korua. Kei a koe, Cheryl, over to you.
Kia ora, ngā mihi nui ki a koutou, ko Cheryl Doig toko ingoa no o te tahi hau. I'm Cheryl, I'm in a very sunny, warm Christchurch, and I'd just like to acknowledge that the place of Ngāi Tahu and in particular of Ngāi Tuahuriri, and also to acknowledge the Mataraka Mahanui and Janina, the work that is done in this space. I thought I'd just take 10 minutes of time to share some of my ideas and went into a space of brain research, I guess. I'm going to share some slides with you. All right, so what I thought I'd start off with was this is a computed tomography of the human brain, and if you know anything about this work, it's like slivers or sections of a 2-dimensional brain going down through layers right down to the brainstem. And for me, when I was thinking about leading for equity, it just reminded me the brain is a really complex thing, and so is equity. It's a journey, not a destination in itself. And just acknowledging that each of us brings to this place our own experiences and our own particular aspects of equity that we're focused on. And so I have a number. I'm particularly passionate about gender equity in the boardroom. But if I looked at all of these pieces of the brain together and thought about this from an equity perspective, I can't look at equity as a whole without being completely overwhelmed. I don't know about you, but sometimes I just think I don't know what I can do in this space or where I am. I hear from a colleague online, 25 million kids in Pakistan don't even go to school. And so which is the bit of the issue, or which one of these slices do I really want to focus in on? And as leaders, we can not focus on everything, but we can influence some of the work, and especially the upstream work in this space. So for me, I've got several focuses, and I want to talk about one of those today, but also the thing that underpins this work for me is the treaty and the acknowledgement as tangata treaty that that's an important lens, but also to bring my lens of acknowledging that I'm a New Zealand Pākehā and the white gaze is my filter. And so I just wanted to talk a little about the white spaces, and this is the work of Anne Milne, who has given me permission to share her slide, just from the point of view of equity starting with self. And I was thinking about all of those, the world at the moment is not so great. There's a whole lot of negativity and racism happening in our world, and it's easy to look at it at the top pieces, but I'm particularly interested in the what's below and the covert white spaces. And Anne, as some of you will know, has been recognised in the latest Queen's Honours for her work in this area. But I was reflecting on this from a personal level as a leader, and what are the things that I have to work really hard to do, because cognitively, being brought up as a Pākehā New Zealand in a Christchurch city that was very English in its early days, and for me it's to be an upstander in those top areas, but it's also I have to swim against my own tide of what I need to change about my own behaviour. And so for me, when I was looking at this, I was thinking about some things, the authentic Māori consultation right from the beginning, having the work starting together. And then I went down the pedagogy of poverty, the Hepperman. I need to do some more exploring that space. So just acknowledging that our personal leadership of self is the starting point for the equity conversation. And the other part of that for me is the acknowledging of the influence that we have on the viewpoints of others, and so the influence today is pretty key. So this is a picture of a colleague of ours, Christine O'Neill, who was the principal at the tūmaki at Christchurch Girls High, and this is her welcoming pulwhiri. And at that pulwhiri, Christine spoke first in Māori. She shared her whakapapa, she acknowledged mana whenua, and she also acknowledged two young women students who were in the audience who had witnessed a racist bus, attack really from a bus driver to a young Muslim student, and they'd taken action and gone to the bus company to bring about change. So right from the beginning, she was talking about equity, tolerance, racism, and being really, really clear in her direction as a leader, what she stood for, and acknowledging those young women for what they had stood up for. So that whole idea of a pocket of promise is there's a lot of negativity in the media, and there's a lot that we need to do as a country, but those pockets of promise, the positive area to grow or the door to open, I think there's some important work we can do in terms of looking for the good spaces and trying to amplify them. So my personal journey in that space, and I've been involved with schools and leadership over a long period of time, and been principals of low and high decile schools and various other roles. But when lockdown happened and there were digital technologies being shared with our young people, I could see that it wasn't a perfect system, and that's not the purpose of this reflection. But what I was really interested and concerned about was the digital equity in that space of who has access and who doesn't. And if you don't have access to technology, that's one barrier for our young people. So digital equity is the little focus that I want to bring to this mahi today. So in the piece that I wrote, it was just a one-pager called Reflection from the Future, set in 2025. And it was a positive take on reflecting back over the last 5 years to today and what had happened so that our young people do have access in terms of the technology and the internet access. The piece was a one-page provocation, and the whole idea of working in this future space is storytelling becomes a really important part of the work, the mahi. So in designing an equitable future, we think about what do we want, what's the preferred future that we want to work towards, and we set that as a goal, and then we work backwards from there. So what the conversations in schools were about was often they're doing some really good work in their homes in terms of technology, not in all cases, but in some. And then schools were saying, and when you come back to school physically for the first time, please bring your device and we'll check it in. And so it's all that work has been lost. So how do we take advantage of that small possibility? And so the one-page scenario then also asks some of these questions about, you know, what would it take to make this come alive? But also some of these questions I think are important for us to ask, because we have to look at why it won't work and what other possibilities are and the pockets of promise or the future that already exists. So that becomes a conversation. So I put the link there to that blog post, and it sort of looks like this in terms of a process of, I went to 2025 and the vision of what it could look like if we did a good job of increasing access. And then went through a process of back mapping. From there, this would need to happen, and from there, this would need to happen to get back to today's world. That process is called back mapping. It's a futures tool that takes you from the world you want to aspire to the current reality. And so in the scenario, without going through all the details, what it did was look at the vision of success is that all learners have equity and access and are using the technology for knowledge pathways and success. But for me, this is also about supporting the culturally responsive learning rather than a one-size-fits-all. So the scenario for 2025 was that Ōtautahi was a thriving place. It was future ready and it had been achieving some really good things. And you'll see that over time from 2020, it was about keeping the devices in the hands of our konga, but also researching and collating opportunities. Now, this was something I threw out there as one lens that I had developed. So again, coming back to it's my own filters, but the purpose of this work is to start a conversation or a provocation, and sometimes it's referred to as a perturbation. You're perturbing the system and seeing what happens. It's like sort of throwing a stone in the water and seeing if ripples happen or not. Even from this, there have been conversations across the city about what might be done, not just in education, but across the network. And one of the things that's happening at the moment is that in our schools across Ōtautahi, there's a survey, there's some research that's being undertaken by GCSN, the Greater Christchurch Schools Network, and they are asking whānau schools, parents, students, teachers, how it has been in terms of digital access during the lockdown, and they'll be able to sift and sort and give that information back to schools, but also use that as a data point, because as well as storytelling, data and research is an important place for convincing people that change needs to happen. So again, this is a back mapping process, but it's just one sliver, one view from my point of view. So it's not meant to be me saying this is what should happen. Here's an idea. What do you think? Why won't it work? Why might it work? There's a bigger picture that's called scenarios in that future storytelling place that involves a whole lot of people in the conversation right from the very beginning. And so I'm going to stop sharing my screen and hand over to Eru, and he's going to take you through the process that Tokona Te Raki have been part of. So over to you, Eru.
Just unmute myself first before I start on a big long me, and then realise no one can hear me. And you have to all look awkward, figuring out who's going to tell me. My mic's muted. Ngā mihi kia koutou, te mihi kia koe Cheryl, te atu ki oku whalaunga, Janina mā, koutou katoa, te atu kia koe Amanda, huri tai awhi o tō tātou whare I tēnei wā, tēnei momo whare, ka nui aku mihi kia koutou. I think I always have that view that the future is something you create, not something you inherit. And we've been doing a whole bunch of mahi with Amanda, so mihi ka koe e hoa, around looking at, you know, sort of insights and, you know, data modeling and, you know, forecasting. But all of that is, you know, they're just like little, ultimately you can't predict the future. You know, so really it's kind of just starting with vision. And so we were kind of intensely in a phase looking at what can we anticipate from previous economic shocks like the global financial crisis, Rogernomics, you know, all of that side of things, trying to anticipate and understand where some of the challenges will be and always match that with where some of the opportunities are. And so I think futures kind of mahi, it can sound so data heavy, but I like to think of it as it's where insights and imagination meet. And I like to think about it that you can't kind of be wrong when you start to look at futures because, yeah, as I said, it's what you create rather than inherent. And so with that, we just sort of started to have a tutu one day where we were all in the middle of, was it lockdown level 4? So hopefully I'm sharing screen. Can everyone see a purple picture? Okay.
Yep, we can.
And so really just thinking about equity to go, I suppose my day job is equity and trying to look at that and think about it and figure stuff out. But it's not really what I'm about. If I think about our pa people, you know, people talk about the 1980s where our papa kāinga were bustling, you know, where you had a post office and buses, you know, bus stops in the pa, where no one was rich, but everyone was doing okay, and where the hapu was growing enough food to support themselves and each other and all the big hui and tangi. And so really when you think about things like when we talk in our own communities, equity's kind of a foreign concept where we're probably talking more like mana motuhake and rangatiratanga. And so really I'm probably motivated around self-determination. And yeah, our people are wildly, fiercely independent, and to go, well, we want to be in a space where we're the kaihotu, we're the steerers of our own waka, we're not paddlers in someone else's waka. And so able to determine our own path, to determine our own future. And so I think equity for me is like a zenith star. So when you look at all of the uncertainty that's around us at the moment, yeah, the whole world's been thrown into reflective space. We don't know what's going to happen. You know, that level of uncertainty, the pace of change. Yeah, we don't have a map. We don't have a plan. We don't have a GPS to guide us. And really, I think there's no better example, cultural template for us in terms of a leadership mode than our navigator ancestors. And for the people that like reading books, there's a beautiful book called Wayfinding Leadership by some of our Māori management academics and some of our celestial navigation experts. And it's really like a story about adaptive leadership. And so to go, well, when crisis happens, when ka huri te ao, ka huri te tikanga. When everything is changing around us, how do we start to pay attention to what's happening externally and being able to navigate that uncertainty? So you can't change the winds, but you can change your sails. And I think when we look at our culture, there are so many phrases of, ki te kāhore he whakakitinga ka ngaro te iwi. Without vision, the people are lost. And so we either have clarity and direction around where we want to go to and can navigate our way and adapt to change. Because if not, we're just suckers that are going to be floating and subject to the whims of tides. And so really, with that navigator metaphor, it's to go, well, how do we diagnose the situation we're in, which is we can't predict what's going to happen. There isn't going to be a standard operating procedure, and we're going to have to learn and adapt our way through things. And the other piece of that is that idea, navigators, and I've done a bit of waka sailing, I put a bit of a proviso. I'm not very good. I like to sleep, so I don't stay up all night watching the stars. So I'm not much of a navigator. At best, I can do the dishes on the waka and help out, and that's about it. But the navigators often talk about seeing the island, and to go, for a navigator, the idea that you have to have absolute clarity in your mind's eye of where your destination is and where you are sitting in position to that destination. Again, imagination. You have to be able to harness that imagination, because you don't have a compass, you don't have GPS, you don't have a map, but you have to have faith. You have to have imagination and crystal clarity in your mind's eye of where you're going, your direction, your trajectory. And then you also have to maintain a constant vigilance to be able to be aware of how you are tracking and how the conditions around you are emerging. So that if the wind changes, well, you just change with it. And so really with that, futures can sound a bit nerdy and complicated, but for the nerds out there, we use a process called transformative scenario planning, and you can get the book by Adam Kahane. So in terms of social innovation, he's pretty awesome. But it's a real simple process where we just sat down and we said, well, okay, here's a grid. Let's have 4 quadrants and let's go, well, what could the future be like? And so we came up with a real simple framework, which was just, well, what happens if we have a recession? What happens if we have a depression? So what happens if we're in this situation for 5 years? What happens if we're in a bad situation for 10 to 15? So that was our kind of bottom axis, and then our vertical axis was kind of old thinking, new thinking. What happens if we just keep doing more of what we were doing, and then really that kind of, partly for us, that colonized, like how do we go back to the way it was, versus, well, what happens if we applied new thinking, if we applied innovation, and if we applied Indigenous values? What could that look like? And so again, it's not overly complicated. We probably overcomplicated it, and mihi to our friend Billy Matheson, who was great in helping guide us through this process. But really, you would have heard Cheryl talk about preferred futures versus plausible. And so really, we sort of settled on, well, te pai tata, and they're a little grey, but to go, well, those are things that are kind of easy to achieve, We just kind of have to keep on doing what we're doing, and we land on those Hawaii. They're Hawaii, te pai tata, they're close, they're easily achieved, they're plausible and possible. But then to go, well, that pai tawhiti, that far horizon, that really beautiful Hawaii nui, that's the top piece, the preferable futures. What would they look like? And what would it feel like? And I think at the moment, you've not meaning to pick on Amanda Reid there, but you've kind of got a lot of future scenarios that are driven by treasury, that are driven by donut economics or neoliberalism, or really starting to try and boil down to what are some basic ideas around values. And again, when you talk about that, when you look at systems change, when you look at futures, ultimately these come from the stories we tell about ourselves. And to go, well, neo-capitalism, that doesn't really, it's not transformational in the sense of it's just kind of improving what we've already done in the past. And so that's really still sits in te pai tata for us versus, well, what happens if we really push the edge and what could that look like? And so, as I said, I'll just share some doodles, but really for the first two scenarios, because I don't want to talk about the last two because they're kind of a waste of time and not really interested in progressing them. So really just thinking about that, and as I said, this was probably hatched over a couple of afternoons in level 4, where we just gave them a name and kind of thought about, well, what would the value be? And so the easiest one was to go, orititanga, and what would it look like if we had a thriving and equitable future where we achieved equity? And as I said, these were fun when you're dealing with data or insight. Like it wasn't what it felt like. You didn't get a headache. This was just fun to go imagine what that could look like. If Māori achieved equity in education, employment, and income. And we told the story of Rangi. And in each of the scenarios, our aim was to sort of talk about agency and to go, well, how do we tell 4 different stories where in each case Rangi ends up okay and ends up, determining his own future. And so in this one, we kind of can see there were some jokes in there for the Ngāi Tahu ones. We sort of had Tua Hiwi Inc., but I thought I might get in trouble for that. And other hapu might complain about taking over the world and things, but just going like, we're Māori are co-owners in the economy, that it's culturally inclusive, it's te tiriti based, and it's built around values of fairness, of justice, and it's kind of that future where, we're all doing good. Rangi's holding an app which is using skills-based analysis, so we talked about that and how supporting whānau into higher level, higher pay, higher value jobs, and how the school was working with the marae around transforming their practices. And so again, this is kind of that vision of orititanga and just even using our imagination to describe what would that look like, what would it feel like, what would it sound like. The second piece, which is kind of my favorite, is to go, well, is orititanga it? Is equity it? And again, equity is kind of my day job, but it's not an end goal or destination. I sort of see that as a marker of progress. And rangatiratanga is something that looks really different. And when you talk to a lot of our communities, it's not like everyone wants to be rich, They go, what would it look like if no one was rich, but everyone had their own home? Everyone was doing okay and was in charge of their own destination and their own trajectory. And so rangatiratanga is not necessarily about, all Māori being middle-class professionals, but about saying, well, rather than thriving in a Western economy, what if we created something different? And what if that was based around different values, around rangatiratanga, and really where you have communities that are leading and shaping their own future? And so you can kind of see hapu enterprises as opposed to hapu Inc., and looking at more collective-based approaches around food production, the waterways being restored and regenerated. And so again, with each of these different scenarios, it's an interesting thing to think about values and to go, well, what are the values we would privilege and hold dear? And what would a future look like if, rather than just assuming, that our economy is as good as it gets, what if we designed, what if we had an economy, an education system that where their purpose was driven by a cultural value? And I think the key thing is too, just to finish up, to go, well, they already are driven by cultural values. It's just probably that they're not explicit about that. And so when we think about that, we have all these assumptions to go, inequality is inevitable, and it's just part of life. To go, well, actually, that's a cultural assumption that we should be able to challenge. So I'll just finish. The last thing is, as I said, that we just created a little grid. And I think what I would encourage is people to have a go at starting to dream about what could be possible, and having some fun with drawing some pictures and telling some stories. And again, that's where the future starts. And again, coming back to that waka navigation, that in order to plot your trajectory into the future, you start with where do you want to get to, your Hawaii. And then, as Cheryl showed before, we did some backcasting, and the key thing we all agreed on is that, yeah, we are talking about pathways to equitable futures, but it was really clear in all of our scenarios that that first kind of step was a commitment to treaty-based approaches to equitable futures. To go that, you know, it's through partnership approaches. That's the key early decision we need to make in terms of backcasting, because that is the gateway that leads towards equitable futures.
I'd like to respond to a couple of things. One is the diverse voices, and I've put in some extra slides that will come out. One of them is about the work on Equity X Design, which is about equity pauses, and always looking at having a pause and saying who's not in the room, whose voices are heard. So that for me is a really important strategy that comes from D School. The digital equity question, effective strategy, GCSN, Greater Christchurch Schools new renewal. They've looked at the access in the homes in the Aranui area, but also the devices and also the training and support for whānau, so that they're not just left with devices and internet with no support. And the third one about disrupting attitudes and practices, I'd refer to the work of Danella Meadows and the levers for change. So those would be the three things. And I've put slides in there for people to follow up with. So Eru, over to you.
You picked all the good, nice, clear ones. I was
Yeah.
going to say, with the Danella Meadows, it's kind of your systems, you know, places to engage. But I think too, like what we've also been talking about is stories. And I'm a very heady person, so it's taken me a long time, because you can think of system change as such a mechanical thing, but ultimately the biggest drivers of our behaviors are stories and values. And so I think a big part of that in terms of disrupting attitudes is to go, well, you can't force people to change their behavior, but what you can do is change how issues are framed and discussed. And that often leads to shifts in mindset. So I think when we look at what can we add as value on an international scene, you know, I think when we look at totality-based approaches, that's something that makes us unique on a global scale. So when we think about, yeah, the lockdown and our manaakitanga and he waka eke noa, that was awesome in the response phase. How do we translate those values so they are embedded as design principles from now onwards? So it wasn't just a blip of 3 months and we look after each other, to then go, well, how do we look after all our tamariki from this moment forward? You know, what would that look like? And what are the what's the new story we need to tell? And we still have bad stories, and I don't want to drag it out, but if you look at even just the budget announcements, yeah, there's still stories underpinning that, which are Māori are labourers, not leaders. And how do we kind of tell a different story around the future, rather than just rehashing all the old solutions from the 1940s? You know, that's literally the playbook we're drawing upon. Let's build our way out of this, versus let's think about what's possible, what's potential, what would we prefer. And when we think ahead 20, 30, 50 years, what's the kind of ideal future we would want to inhabit? And again, it sounds so simple, but when you have clarity around where you're going, then you can start with thinking about, well, what's the waka we need to build today in order to start us on our journey to take us towards that future we aspire to.